Welcome to the Hub Roundtable for the 13th of Friday. Very, very scary. Lots of big events going on in the world, and we're going to dig into it all with Sean Speer, my co-founder and editor-at-large. Sean, great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you as always.
Boy, look at that vacation visage in your face for those of us joining us on YouTube here to watch the Friday Roundtable. You are looking relaxed, my friend. A week on the beach has served you well.
Yeah, although one thing I've discovered after 4 or 5 years in the news business is that whenever you have aspirations to take a break, the world conspires against you. Isn't that true, Roger?
Yeah, and it certainly has the last 18 hours. So let's dedicate the first half of the show to what we think is a bit more our expertise, which is the Canadian reaction to this remarkably successful, at least in the early hours, Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program. And then the back half of the show, Sean, let's pick up on our conversation that we had with our members and donors about how the media is covering the early days of the Carney government. Some great feedback we want to share from our audience where we kind of question the Hub community. How should the Hub weigh in on Carney? And then let's weigh in a little bit on Carney. A few things that happened this week that I think caught our eye. But let's start with the Canadian reaction, especially the political reaction, Sean, to this, again, I would just say remarkably successful in its early hours attack by Israel on Iran. What are you seeing that caught your eye this morning in terms of official Ottawadom and how it's thinking about all this?
Yeah, I've been surprised, I must admit, Roger. As you know, and a lot of our listeners and viewers know, the Trudeau, now Carney government has sought to kind of saw the baby in half when it's come to Israel's ongoing war in Gaza. And although I disagree with them along those lines, one can kind of understand that there are different perspectives and different points of view. One can, for instance, be critical of the Israeli prosecution of the war. You know, one can obviously have a lot of concern and sympathy for the Gazans who are in an awful situation because, of course, Hamas attacks against Israel. But the instinct to continue that on one hand, this, on the other hand, that perspective in the face of what strikes me as an attack or a strike against Iran's nuclear capability that is self-evidently in the interests of the West and self-evidently in the interests of Canada is really bizarre to me. And yet that's what we've heard from the government in the past several hours.
Let me just read the key words here from Anita Anand, our Minister of Foreign Affairs. Canada is closely following the escalation of tensions between Israel and Iran, so states the minister. She then goes on to say, further action risks triggering a broader regional conflict with devastating consequences. De-escalation must be a priority, she writes. We urge all parties to refrain from actions that further destabilize the region. The protection of civilians must be paramount. So unpack that for us, Sean.
Well, I just don't understand how a Canadian government projecting Canadian interests abroad would characterize Israel, an ally in this case, and Iran, an obvious enemy to Western values, Western interests, who's pursuing a nuclear capability precisely for those purposes, would be characterized as equal parties. It reflects, Rudyard, as you said to me over the past several hours, a moral equivalence, which, I don't know, it's funny. It reflects almost like both a lack of a moral framework to evaluate these types of episodes, but also a disconnect from our national interests, which then prompts the question, what is guiding Canadian foreign policy when the Trudeau, now Carney government, is confronted with these fundamental episodes?
Yeah. Well, look, I think everybody hopes and wishes not to have a war between Israel and Iran, but I want to pick up on what you said there, Sean, because I think statements like these, were de rigueur during the Trudeau years. They were also a big feature, Sean, of the Biden administration and how it did on the one hand this, on the other hand that, as a constant refrain. And look, there are some situations where I think governments need to strike balance in terms of their message, especially the United States as the world superpower. But in this case, I mean, let's talk about who these two protagonists are. On one hand, you have the state of Israel, which has faced now for years a drumbeat of information, not just from their intelligence services, not just from the CIA, but from respected international groups like the International Atomic Energy Association and others that documented Iran's slow and steady approach to acquiring a nuclear weapon, enriching uranium to higher and higher levels well beyond any civilian need, developing missile and other technology, that could then bootstrap that enrichment to quickly jump, to break out to a bomb. Add on top of that this is a brutal theocracy. This is a regime that has murdered, tortured, and imprisoned thousands upon thousands of its citizens, including Canadian dual nationals who've gone to Iran and been trapped in Iran's worst prisons for speaking out about human rights. This is a regime that most recently, when women courageously protested against religious police in Iran and their suppression of women's rights, used pellet guns to fire into crowds of women to purposely disfigure their faces. I'm sorry, Sean, you can maybe hear in my voice the frustration here, but this is not, if there ever was a moment not to engage in moral equivalency, this is it. This is a moment to say this was a scourge on humanity, the race towards an Iranian bomb. And Israel, forced after years of patiently waiting for the international community to do something about this, has now had to act because intelligence, not just Israeli intelligence, but Western intelligence and respected international agencies had indicated that Iran was literally within weeks, possibly days, to breaking out into a nuclear power and threatening Israel, as it has through the course of the revolutionary regime's existence, with Israel's annihilation. So I'm a little frustrated here, Sean, because I would think that if this was one moment to kind of cast off the Biden-Trudeau era, on the one hand this, on the other hand this kind of moral equivalency, surely the last 18 hours would be that time.
Yeah, well said, Rudyard. And it's worth emphasizing for our audience that the Carney government's reaction has put it offside a lot of Canada's major allies, some of whom have shared the Carney government's misgivings, or at least questions or doubts about the ongoing military operation in Gaza. That is to say, France and Germany and others have saluted Israel's steps on behalf of the West, frankly, to step in and surgically and precisely undermine Iran's ability to develop a nuclear capability. So those countries, those political leaderships, Rudyard, have been able to walk and chew gum at the same time. That is to say, they've been able to make the case that Israel needs to bring a resolution to the operation in Gaza, and on the other hand, be able to recognize that its strike in Iran is a victory for the West. The fact that the government can't do that signals that its moral equivalence is not, or its doubts about Israel, not limited to Gaza. It has become part of how the Canadian government thinks about Israel's security and defense efforts throughout the region. In a way, it signals that it is thinking about Israel differently, more comprehensively, in a single way than it is other jurisdictions. I think that's unhealthy, and I think it's unbecoming of a G7 country, incidentally, that's set to host other G7 leaders in the coming days. Yeah.
And just, think about the strange tale of two cities. On one hand, this government and the previous Trudeau government enthusiastically supported Ukrainian attacks on Russia, as did the Hub, as do I. And even most recently, when Ukrainians special operations went deep into Russia to attack its strategic nuclear forces, its bombers with drones. Canadian politicians, Bob Rae, others, our UN ambassadors, saluted this, cheered on the Ukrainians. But isn't it interesting when it comes to Israel, and Israel does something, I would say, similar in both form and substance, just like Ukraine is attacking a brutal regime in the Putin regime, so is Israel attacking a democracy like Ukraine, attacking a theocracy in Iran that, like Russia, represents an existential threat to Israel in the same way that Russia represents an existential threat to Ukraine. But no, it's different. The language is different. It's not the emphatic language. It's not the language of moral clarity that's applied from Canadian officialdom to the Ukrainians in their noble struggle against Russia. Instead, Sean, we get this parsing, this doublespeak. Yes. And I come to you with this question because it's not a pretty one. In fact, it's a somewhat ugly question.
Yes.
Why? Why does the Jewish state receive a different rhetorical treatment than the Ukrainian state? What's your answer?
Yeah, it's an excruciating question, isn't it? Because it's how I opened our conversation. I agree. What explains the moral equivalence? What explains characterizing Iran and Israel as equal parties? What explains Canada being offside, not just the Americans, but the French and the Germans? Countries that, like Canada, at various points have asked tough questions of the Israeli government's ongoing operations in Gaza. Let's call a spade a spade. I think a big part of it, Rudyard, is that over the past 20 years or so, the Liberal Party, the center of gravity is on these questions has shifted. There are various explanations. I think part of it is inherent to progressive politics. And as we've talked about in the past, the oppressor victim psychology that is now part of progressive politics. But I think we should also be clear that a part of it also is the Liberals playing diaspora politics in different Arab and Muslim communities across the country, particularly in parts of the GTA. I don't think it's an accident that we've seen this steady erosion of liberal support for Israel over the past several election cycles as it's clinging to power by winning those seats in and around the GTA. And we've seen, by the way, liberal members of parliament say one thing to Jewish synagogues and others to Muslim places of worship. I think when you do politics that way, Rudyard, you end up with statements like the one we got today from our foreign affairs minister.
Yeah. And again, I just remind listeners and viewers, if you're saying, wow, these guys, I don't know, like this, I don't agree with this. Well, again, look at the example of Ukraine and explain to anyone how, let's give credit where credit is due. The Trudeau government had moral clarity on Ukraine's struggle with Russia. Why don't we have the same moral clarity with Israel's struggle with Iran? I think Sean's answers are spot on. And my final observation on this, Sean, is this week, Mark Carney, to his credit and to the credit of the Liberal Party, announced a ambitious, fast target to 2% spending of GDP to meet our NATO requirements. Bravo. It's taken us a long time to get here. I'm not going to, well, maybe I'll chastise a little bit the lollygagging over the last decade to make the inevitable decision to honor our NATO commitment of 2%. But I would just challenge viewers, listeners, maybe some liberals listening. We know they're out there. They're Carney fans who come on to our podcast and our YouTube channel. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate that you're opening your mind to different perspectives. But I would just say, what's the point of spending the billions of dollars more to meet our NATO requirement to develop an enhanced defense and security capacity if we don't have a moral framework to use that capacity for the betterment of ourselves and a world based on, principles of democracy, freedom, and national self-determination. So I worry here, Sean, that we're putting the cart before the horse. We're gonna engage in what will be a once-in-a-generation investment in our military and defense capacity, but we will lack the moral language and the moral frameworks to apply that capacity to render a better world for Canada and our fellow democracies like the State of Israel.
Yeah, well said, Roger. I'll just closing by saying that there's a tendency in foreign policy circles that emphasizes nuance and complexity and is skeptical of simplicity and simplistic answers. And I get that. Obviously, the world is a complicated place. But oftentimes I think, you wouldn't be totally poorly served by just relying on my grandfather's and Thunder Bay's good sense. And he doesn't understand the intricacies of Middle Eastern politics or the evolution of Iran's theocracy and its interaction between the secular and non-secular parts of the country and all the rest. But I think he would say Israel is a liberal democratic state. It's a longtime ally of Canada. Iran's interest in developing a nuclear capability isn't just about its regional interests. It's ultimately about projecting its ideological ambitions to the world. And my grandfather would say it's a good thing that Israel, in the night, used its extraordinary defense and security capabilities to undermine Iran's ability to represent a threat to the region and the rest of the world. And that is something we should be applauding. Obviously, we'll wait to see what happens in the coming days, and we pray that ultimately this doesn't escalate into a major conflict. But sometimes I think the foreign affairs officials in Ottawa would be better served kind of channeling my grandfather and less of the so-called sophistication that one finds in global affairs circles and all the rest.
Yeah, there's a place for nuance. Nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capability for an autocratic, theocratic regime that has a long history of terrorism, not only in the Middle East, but in the West and around the world. Sorry, the time for nuance had passed, and I think we should be thankful that the State of Israel is now taking on a security dimension that impacts and affects Canada. The whole reason we're talking potentially about joining the United States to create a Golden Dome, a missile defense system to the tune of possibly hundreds of billions of dollars, is in no small part, being sold and conceived of as to possibly defend against a future nuclear capable Iran. And we didn't do this with North Korea. No one had the stomach. No one had the stomach to put aside the parsing and the can kicking to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat. And what do we have now? Yes. We have an ICBM capable North Korea that can threaten the west coast of Canada and the United States. So look, we're going to follow this conflict closely here at the Hub, but and it's not that we should be cheerleading Israel, but we should be standing with an ally at a moment where it is dealing with an urgent security need that it could no longer ignore, and arguably is dealing with a security issue that is not immaterial to Canada and Canadians. The threat of a nuclear Iran is not just a problem for Israel, it's a problem for the world. So let's say goodbye, Sean, to our free complimentary listeners and viewers who are tuning into the first half of the Roundtable on our podcast feed. And on our YouTube channel, we hope we've given you something a little bit to think about, maybe a debate or two kicking off around the kitchen table if you're tuning into this podcast and YouTube video with friends and family. Urge you to come over to the Hub and become a Hub hero. For $1 a week, you get the full-length editions of the Roundtable and Conversation with David Frum, all of our best paid content on our website. You can do that right now at www.thehub.ca. So I'll say goodbye to you, our free listeners, and we'll join our donors on the other side of this short break.